Okay, so if you're anything like me, you probably have a common theme that appears through all of your favorite books, and for me, that's mommy issues. Recently, I've been reading a lot of books with great mommy issues rep, and with Mother's Day coming up, I thought, why not do a whole recommendation video with books that have mommy issues so that you can also drown your sorrows in fiction. Okay, all jokes aside, I actually love my mother. She is the sweetest soul, and I care for her so much. But as a daughter of immigrants, I do have some gripes with my mother that manifest themselves in ugly ways and ways that I need to talk about in therapy, but I do really love reading about mommy issues in books. Even if those mommy issues are way more escalated than mine, I think it's just a really interesting topic and a really interesting relationship, the relationship between a mother and a daughter or a mother and son. One thing you'll notice with all these books is that they also involve a lot of like generational trauma and examining the relationship of women and mothers throughout generations, which I think is just so well done in a lot of these books and which makes for some really amazing and profound books. If you're new here, I'm Jananie and this is my channel, This Story Ain't Over, where I give you overly specific book recs every now and then. Now, if you're really new here, you've probably never heard me talk about one of my favorite book services ever, which is Book of the Month, and who is sponsoring today's video. Those of you who have been around here for a while know that I absolutely love them as an online book service. Book of the Month curates a selection of new and early release titles every month, and you can choose to get one of those books in your blue Book of the Month box every month. Book of the Month's mission is to help you find books that you're gonna love while also promoting new and emerging authors. One of my favorite things about Book of the Month is that they're super flexible. If ever you don't like the selections for a particular month, you can actually skip that month for free and not get charged. Another aspect I really love about Book of the Month is that if you don't feel like getting a physical copy for that month, you can choose to get an audiobook of one of these selections instead and listen to it on their app. As an audiobook girly, I do have to appreciate this level of choice. Now for April, Book of the Month was kind enough to send me 2 of their selections, and first up I have How to End a Love Story by Yulin Kwong. Those of you who have read Beach Read by Emily Henry, you might be interested to know that the author of this book is actually the screenwriter for the adaptation of Beach Read. Needless to say, I'm hyped to hear from this author, and the book actually features a main character who is a screenwriter herself. And then the other book that I picked was Dragon Fruit by Makia Lucier. This seems like it's going to be a really fun and interesting fantasy. It's set on an island kingdom and involves a magical dragon fruit, and one of the main characters is from a kingdom that is from a matriarchal society, which I feel like fits for our topic today, so really excited to pick this one up. As always, I'm so impressed with Book of the Month selections for each month, and if you're interested in either of these books or one of the other selections for April, you can grab your first Book of the Month box for only $5 with the code PASTEL. That is an incredible deal for a new release hardcover book because, as we all know, books are expensive these days, so you should definitely go grab that deal, $5 with the code PASTEL. Alrighty, with that said, let's get into the book recs for this video. I've got a couple different types of books for you. I've got some literary fiction, and then I've also got some slightly speculative fiction books as well. A lot of the literary fiction is really heartbreaking and profound and also has a lot of triggers as well, so I would just be mindful of a lot of these books and search up content warnings before getting into them so that you're not harming yourself. With that said, this first book rec is one that's definitely going to shatter you into pieces, and that is A Woman Is No Man by Ataf Rum. This was actually the March book club pick for my book club, the Boundless Book Club on Fable. The mission of the book club is to read more books from marginalized authors and expand our horizons. So I curate a book each month that I think fits that criteria, and we all read it together on the app Fable, where you can discuss the book without spoilers in these little chat rooms for each chapter and connect with other people on the app. So if you're interested in reading with me and thousands of other people, go check out the link down below, download Fable, and join the book club. So this book is a really heartbreaking book. It's very profound, and it's honestly one that just left me in tears by the end. The book follows 3 generations of Palestinian women. It starts with the grandmother Farida, and then we have the daughter-in-law Isra, and then we have the granddaughter Dea. The book sort of flips between these 3 perspectives and also between 2 timelines. We have a timeline that starts in 1990 when Isra marries Farida's son and moves from Palestine to America, and then we have the timeline in 2008 where Isra's daughter Dea is sort of finishing high school and she is starting to realize that there's something mysterious about her parents' death. What I loved about this book was that it had such complex relationships between the women, and it really highlights the powerlessness that these women feel in their situations and how they're both forced to live a life that they never really wanted and that makes them unhappy, but they also find themselves upholding this structure of patriarchy that keeps them oppressed. This book has one of the most craziest twists ever, but it also features some really beautiful writing and just some really complex character work. Like, I'm never never read characters that are just so complex and so real. I felt like these were characters that I knew in real life. They felt reminiscent of some family I know and like older generations I know. And in some ways they even reminded me of my own mother and my own culture and all of these structures of patriarchy that are still lurking here and still causing an effect on our lives. This book delves into the concept of like shame and reputation and how women are expected to live a certain life and how they are repeatedly devalued in comparison to men. For those of you who are from immigrant families, I feel like a lot of this will be very familiar to you, but for those of you who are not, I think there's still something to be learned from this story and from the complex relationships between these women. And by the end of it, I think you'll really come to feel for these characters and what they've been through. Alrighty, the next book that I have is also by the same author, and that is Evil Eye by Atof Rum. This was one of my first reads of 2024, and I have to say it was just absolutely stunning. Similar to A Woman Is No Man, this book goes through the idea of generational trauma and how that passes through women specifically. The book follows our main character Yara, who is a Palestinian American woman. She teaches art at this college. She has two wonderful daughters that she loves. She's educated, and she has a husband that gives her more freedom than her mother ever saw. But beyond the seemingly picture-perfect life that she has, she finds herself just totally dissatisfied with life and sort of sad and not able to shake any of these feelings. The inciting incident of the book is when a incident happens at her college and Yara has to step away from her job. She starts to reconsider a lot of aspects of her life. And while this book covers a lot of similar themes to A Woman Is No Man, it also delves deeper into the concept of mental illness and mental health and how women who have faced generational trauma, abuse, and like dislocation can really be affected in negative ways when it comes to their mental health. This delves into the idea that many immigrant kids have, where they have it much better off than their parents, but they still feel unsatisfied and they still feel unhappy and they don't know how to reconcile that feeling. This was such a powerful book, and the relationship between Yara and her mother and that whole aspect was just so heartbreaking and just so profound. There are parts of the book where Yara is writing in her journal and there are like flashbacks to moments with her mother, and it really just shows how a lot of her relationship with her mother has informed her life now. Atof Rum is just such an amazing writer, and I'm just so happy that I've picked up both of these books, so I really want more of you to pick them up. Alright, the next book that I have is also by a Palestinian author, and that is You Exist Too Much by Zaina Arafat. Like Atof Rum's books, this book also delves into the topic of cultural and religious identities, but what I love about this book is that it also delves into sexual identities and queer identities when it comes to, you know, more conservative cultures and like immigrant cultures as well. This book really delves into the concept of shame and also a sense of wanting to belong somewhere. The inciting incident of this book is essentially when the main character reveals to her mother that she is queer and is met with this sort of negative reaction, and also her mother saying, "You exist too much." She has this sense of shame towards her daughter and wants her to sort of minimize herself. And from there we see the story through these vignettes that flash between the United States and the Middle East, as the main character has different professions, she lives in different places, and she has different relationships, and also goes through some really intense struggles with her mental health. This book is definitely a ride if you're gonna read it, and it definitely goes in different directions, but I think it's so worth it by the end, and I just loved the exploration of these different identities that the character had. Needless to say, the mommy issues in this one were strong, and although they don't have a full-on resolution, I think, the way that some of the other books on this list will, this was still a really valuable story. Alright, this next book is probably one of my favorite books ever, and that's partly because it's written by a Tamil author. I am Sri Lankan Tamil, so this was just like really relatable to me because the culture was mine, and that book is Marriage of a Thousand Lies by S.J. Sindhu. If you haven't read from S.J. Sindhu before, she's fantastic. She has a few other books out as well that I think you should definitely pick up, but this one in particular I think has the strongest mommy issues to it because it essentially follows a main character who is a lesbian, and she knows that her family and her community will never accept her sexuality, and so she ends up in this marriage of convenience with one of her friends who's gay, and they have this fake marriage to appease their family, but this all sort of goes down the tank when our main character returns home to her family for a visit and finds out that her first love, a woman, is getting married to a man. This book is definitely on like the slower end, but I think the parts between the main character and her mother are the parts that are just so heartbreaking to me and also just like felt so familiar to me. Like the earlier books that I mentioned that dealt with Palestinian American characters, this one also deals with the sense of shame and the idea of reputation and what will people say, and how these family relationships are complicated by the sense of culture and like reputation that they need to uphold, and how that sometimes takes precedence over their love for their child. And also how these mothers just think that they're looking out for their daughters when really they are like harming them instead. This is a book that asks a lot of questions but definitely doesn't give you enough answers, but I think that's sort of how life is, and I felt like it was just so realistic, so I appreciated that a lot. Alright, this next one is actually a YA, and that is All My Rage by Sabaa Tahir. This book I really love because it also explores the idea of generational trauma. It deals with Pakistani American main characters. This book is less about like a mother-daughter relationship, and it's actually more to do with a mother-son relationship, and also just how a mother's life affects her children's lives. This book follows a pair of Pakistani American main characters. They're sort of in this star-crossed lovers situation, and they're both dealing with very intense struggles on their own ends. But sprinkled throughout the story, we actually get perspective chapters from the boy's mother, which is Misbah, and we're following her in Pakistan, and then as she travels to America to start this new life, to sort of chase the American dream, and how the American dream sort of always is out of her grasp. This book deals with generational trauma, but also the pain of like broken dreams, and I think as you read this book, you'll just come to feel for these characters so much, and you just want the best for them, but sometimes that's just really complicated, and life just tends to throw you so many more battles than you think you can handle. This book also deals a lot with the topic of grief, and I think the way it was done was just so beautiful and just heartbreaking, and I was just sobbing by the end. So yeah, get ready with the tissues for this one because it will really break your heart. On a similar note, the next book is The Stationery Shop by Marjan Kamali, and this book also deals with a star-crossed lover situation, a topic of generational trauma, but we also do get the representation of a character who becomes a mother later on and is dealing with that difficulty as well. Essentially, this book starts in 1950s Tehran, Iran, and it follows these two main characters who fall in love at the time and are brutally ripped apart by the political situation going on, and also some reasons larger than themselves, some meddling from other people. And so we follow them later on in life as they are living their own separate lives and moving to America and going through that process. And the book also opens with this sort of frame narrative of the characters meeting in our present day, and then the book like flips back to when they met, and then we're trying to figure out what happened in between. This is both a really powerful love story, but also really delves into the topic of generational trauma, of motherhood, of mental illness and mental health, and especially how that affects women, I think. And I think it was just done so beautifully, and it's a book that will just leave you in tears by the end. So again, get the tissues ready because this one was just so heartbreaking, but I loved every moment of it. Alrighty, these next couple books that I have are actually a little bit more lighter on the mommy issues, but I do feel like it has a strong enough aspect of it, and it also affects one of the main characters in each of these books. So first I have Cleopatra and Frankenstein by Coco Malors. This is a really stunning literary fiction novel that essentially follows two main characters to start, who sort of meet on New Year's Eve in New York and strike up this unlikely romance, and then we're following them through the next year of their relationship after they get married to help Cleo with her visa. And then we're also following many other characters, including their friends and family and other people who sort of intersect with their story, and we get their perspective chapters as well and really start to understand them as characters. And I think what's just really stunning about this book is just the way that it portrays these very messy characters who are super flawed and not perfect and who are just going through the ringer but also making lots of bad decisions. Now where the mommy issues come in is with one of our main characters, Cleo. Her mother has been long dead, and she's sort of dealing with her complicated emotions surrounding that and the way that her mother died, and it ultimately creeps into her life in a very sinister way, and it starts to affect her mental health in a very negative way. Again, search up trigger warnings for all of these books because this one has some intense ones as well, especially when it comes to Cleo. But I do think the portrayal of mental illness and mental health in this book was just so stunning, and I think the way that Cleo is so affected by the way her mother's life went is just so indicative of how, you know, mommy issues can really affect someone. Similarly, I have Big Swiss by Jen Began, and this also deals with a main character who has a passed away mother, and that relationship has always been complicated, and also just the feelings toward how her mother died is very complicated as well. But essentially this book follows our main character Greta, who I believe is like in her 40s or something, so this is like a book where we actually have an older main character, which is really nice. But she's essentially going through this moment where she's reconsidering her entire life. She's completely upended her life. She's moved to New York, she's staying with this friend, and she's living a completely different life than she previously had before. Now in New York, she's also working as a transcriber for this sex therapist, and she finds herself sort of falling in love with one one of the sex therapist's patients. And from there, the book is sort of a series of hilarious and unfortunate events. It's both a satire and also a really heartfelt story about this woman going through this change in her life, and it also deals with sort of romantic obsession, and it has a sapphic relationship, and it also has themes of adultery and mental illness. This book is definitely more on the fun side compared to some of the other books on this list, so I definitely think it's a fun one to pick up, but it'll also pack a punch, and you'll find yourself feeling so much for Greta as a character, because I think although she's a very flawed and messy character, you can really understand where she's coming from. Alrighty, with that said, we're going to move on to the 3 speculative fiction books that I have to share with you that deal with some mommy issues. So the first one that I have is The School for Good Mothers by Jessamine Chan. This is a really excellent sort of slightly dystopian novel, I would say. It's sort of set in our real world, but seems sort of amplified in certain aspects and exaggerated in certain aspects. But essentially it follows our main character, who is a mother, and she's sort of a struggling mother, and after a series of a few mistakes with her child, she ends up having her child legally taken away, and she's forced to go to this school to learn how to be a good mother. And so from there, we're following our main character as she's struggling to get her child back, and she's in this creepy dystopian-esque school for these different mothers who have been deemed bad mothers and who need to sort of go through this training and learning to be good mothers. But the concept of what a good mother means is sort of warped and strange. And there's also an aspect of how, you know, the onus is always sort of put on the mothers rather than the fathers. This is both a heartbreaking book, but it's also a very weird and interesting one. And it deals with our sort of misogynistic social order and the patriarchy and how that has affected mothers' roles in life and in their child's lives. The last thing I'll say about this one is that it's also got a really big theme of like surveillance and sort of like this big brother feeling to it, so it's definitely kind of fun on that end. The next book that I have involves vampires, and that is Woman Eating by Claire Coda. But specifically, we actually only follow one vampire, and that's our main character. She's sort of a mixed race young vampire, and she was turned into a vampire by her mother, who was also a vampire, when she was very young, when she was like a baby. And so she's lived her whole life as a vampire, and she's lived very sheltered with her mother. And so the book sort of starts when our main character has sort of run away from her mother and split off from her mother to try and have her own life. But she finds herself sort of incapable of dealing with all of the adulting aspects of just being on her own and also just being a vampire on her own. This is less a fantasy horror novel than it is a literary fiction novel for like girls with mommy issues and eating disorders. The concept of eating and thirst and hunger are really strong in the book, as are the ideas of this complicated relationship between mother and daughter, and the idea of just like leaving the nest and trying to be your own person. And overall, it's just a weird and interesting book that I think is kind of worth a shot. Alrighty, the final book that I have to recommend for you today is Rouge by Mona Awad. Mona Awad is a really beloved author, and this is one of her most recent books, and this one in particular deals the most with sort of the idea of mommy issues and a complicated relationship between a mother and daughter, and also deals with the idea of grief. Essentially, our main character, Belle, is forced to return to Southern California, where she grew up, when her estranged mother, Noelle, dies. And so from there, Belle has to deal with all of her mother's stuff and also her considerable debts. It starts to be revealed that Noelle was having these very pricey beauty treatments, and Belle herself has been obsessed with the idea of beauty and skincare and watches these like skincare videos very intensely and on repeat and watches so many. And then she also finds herself sort of approached by these people who want to provide her with further beauty treatments. This has been described as a mix between Snow White and Eyes Wide Shut, and it's sort of a very gothic fairy tale-esque book. But at the root of all this speculativeness is the relationship between the mother and daughter, and how Belle's life has been complicated by her mother's view of her, and how she was always sort of trying to live up to her mother's beauty expectations. This is definitely a weird one, so I would suggest strapping in for the ride, but I love the way that it tackled sort of the mother-daughter situation and the complicated nature of it. With that said, those are all of the books that I wanted to recommend today. Let me know down below if you have read any of these books and what you thought of them, or if you're planning to pick up any of them, and let me know if you have any book recommendations for books with mommy issues. I'm sending my love to all of you who have complicated relationships with your mothers or are dealing with grief during this time. I hope that these books can be a bit of a comfort for you as well. With that said, thank you guys so much for watching, and definitely go check out my Instagram, Goodreads, TikTok, and Bindery community down below, where you can get exclusive content from me, including monthly TBRs, journal entries, Zoom hangouts, and lots more. I'll see you guys in my next video, and please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!